Hello, everyone. We are live. My name is Shannon Kennedy, and I am the head coach of the Add1Challenge. And today I have Benny Lewis of Fluent in 3 Months, which runs the Add1Challenge with me. And we are going to answer your questions about the Add1Challenge and about language learning. This is the kickoff call for the Add1Challenge 38, and I'll turn it over to Benny to introduce himself.
Yeah, everybody, I'm really excited that you can all join us today. It's so much fun to be kind of a part of this whole Add1 thing now, as we currently are, since that was the theme of my life for many, many years. And I'm going to be getting back into that again soon, where just intensive language learning and doing it as a part of a community makes such a big difference. The first few years that I did it before I started sharing it with the blog and I started communicating with other people, it was very difficult. It was very stressful. And I felt very alone in seeing that I'm the only one who's trying to do this. But as soon as I started sharing it online, pre-Add1 days, it just made a world of difference for me. And then that's kind of that inspired Brian Kwong to make the Add1Challenge. And from there, I'm so glad that now Fluent in 3 Months is actually running it, because it represents everything good about what I found to be the community aspect of learning languages.
So we're just getting started with a new challenge, and you've done several 3-month challenges, almost around a dozen probably. So you have a lot of experience with starting a challenge. So what would your advice be for picking out which resources are going to be a good fit starting the challenge and creating a plan going forward?
So I think one of the biggest dangers when starting the challenge is putting too much thought into everything, and it's kind of you can reach a stage of perfectionist paralysis, as it were, because if you're thinking, what is exactly the right resource that I need to use, where exactly do I need to start, which words do I need to use? I mean, these are all very important questions, obviously, and if you ignore those questions, then you don't know what to do at all. So it's a very difficult balance, because if you put too much thought into something versus putting no thought into something, then you're not going to know where to start at all. But for me, what has helped a ton has been to just do something. So every day to do something and feel like I am genuinely getting myself to what my end goal is. And in my case, that's always the conversation. And that's a very important core aspect of the Add1Challenge for a lot of people. And so I want to be able to say something and have some form of basic conversation. So for me personally, I would always make sure that I've got a Skype or other video call with teachers scheduled, and that I just have that coming up. And that's kind of, that forces me to figure out the resources. Because if I just go into Google and type Spanish learning resources, then I'm just going to get what the best search engine optimized web pages for that currently are. I'm not necessarily going to get the best answers for me. Whereas if I try to have a conversation and then I realize, I think my biggest problem right now is I can't roll my R, then I'm going to go and learn that. So I kind of, rather than creating a plan for the next few months, I try to adapt my plan to what my biggest issue currently is. And so I just try to start speaking and see. It's very difficult because there's 1,000 issues you have when you start. So many things that you need, so many problems to solve. But if you do it with help, a teacher might be able to tell you, I think right now your biggest problem is that you just need some basic vocabulary. So learn a few verbs, even if you don't get them in the right grammatical structure within a sentence. You can say, I want to eat tomorrow, and that's fine. That's kind of where I start, is Tarzan version of the language, and that means I can begin communicating.
Another thing that I'd like to add to that is that you can keep a language notebook. So that way, as you're learning the language, you can take your notes in it. And when you don't understand something, rather than getting distracted and trying to go look that thing up, because like Benny said at the beginning, there's going to be a million of these things, and you want to try and keep as much focus so that your progression continues to move forward. So just make a little note in your notebook saying, I don't get this, I need to come back to it. And then that way, later on during your challenge, if you're ever feeling stuck, you don't know what to study, or you're not sure what to work on, you can go back to these things that you've written in your notebook and tackle them one at a time. And so not only does this allow you to stay focused on what you're currently working on, it also gives you direction to go on later on when you're ready to come back to those things. And then sometimes some of those things get resolved on their own just through the natural progression of learning a language. And so then you don't even need to worry about them. So our next question is, what is different about the Add1Challenge? So one of the things that we've done this year is we've improved the Add1Challenge quite a bit. We've added a lot of different things. We, for example, have added several other iterations of the challenge. So there's now Add1 Advance as well, which is for students who have already completed an Add1Challenge and are looking to take their language to the next level. So get beyond that 15-minute conversation and continue improving. It's a little bit more intense, which is part of the reason why we ask learners to participate in the regular challenge first, so they get a feel for the system and the requirements and for the experience of the Add1Challenge. And it's the perfect next step after you've completed a challenge. There's also Add1 Maintenance, which is a version of the challenge for maintaining your languages and doing more than one. And then there's the regular Add1Challenge, which now includes something called Add1 Boost, which is, it basically shares Benny's scripting technique. So we have it available for several specific languages, such as Korean, French, and Spanish. There's also a version of it for languages that we don't yet have the course for that specific language yet. And it's all about scripting. So Benny, scripting is definitely a tactic that you use when you are learning new languages. Do you want to talk about that technique a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I know is such a big challenge is when you're presented in the moment, and especially if you're doing like I'm suggesting of actually talking to a native speaker in some form, even online, as early as possible. The problem is they might ask you a question like, what do you do for a living? And if you have to, in that moment, construct the sentence from scratch, and you have to think, okay, what's the present tense conjugation of this verb, and how did do I add an O at the end of this? And if you to think of all of this in the moment, then that makes it very difficult. It makes it very awkward. Whereas what I found is in a lot of conversations, there are a lot of patterns and there are a lot of very specific things that tend to happen and tend to come up very often. And in my case, if I was using a language in the city and I'd be social, going out and meeting people, I would essentially say the same thing when I first met them of, I'm Benny from Ireland. I'm here to learn French. I started learning French 3 months ago, or whatever I wanted to say. And that is essentially a script. And what I can do ahead of time is write that out, go through it with my teacher so that I can correct it and make sure that the grammar is good, and then memorize that script. And then essentially, once I have it in memory, if the question comes up, like what brings you to Paris, then I can go into autopilot and I could just say all of this stuff that I've prepared, and I don't have to be thinking of how did I construct this sentence and where exactly does the adjective go and the preposition. No, I could just have this script ready and say it. And a lot of your basic language learning conversations are predictable. And this means that you can actually construct these sentences ahead of time with help. You can spend the time looking the words up and then just commit that to memory. And you can't do this with everything. Obviously, there's going to be lots of conversations that branch off that are new and spontaneous. But I tell you, it gives you so much confidence if you can start with momentum and you can answer that question, why are you here? Or like, when did you start learning this language? And you just have an answer ready. It gets that momentum up. And that's like such a crucial thing, that first response that you have, and you can prepare for that. So that's kind of why scripts are so important for me. I try to think of as many scripts as I can, but essentially the basics of just who I am and what I do and that kind of thing, why I'm learning the language. These are the ones that tend to come up the most often, and those are the ones I start with.
All right, HA asks, I see that learners in the challenge are posting that they're using specific resources. Are those the resources that I'm supposed to be using too? Short answer is no, you're welcome to use any resources that you like while participating in the Add1Challenge. If you find that a particular resource works for you, then go ahead and continue to use that. Benny, do you have anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like I was saying before. The resources question, it is important, but it's also something that we can get hung up a bit too much on, and that's not really what the Add1Challenge is about. The Add1Challenge is not saying use this specific app and then use this website for exactly 13 and a half minutes. It doesn't really work like that. The Add1Challenge is a community that's going to support you, that you can go into to talk about your challenges, and you could say, this is the specific problem that I have, and then we can talk it out with you. But if you see someone recommend a resource and the way they describe it seems interesting to you, maybe check it out. But don't feel too much pressure towards it. And Shannon might recommend several resources as well, and it's just from her experience that these are the best ones that have helped the most people. But it doesn't mean you absolutely have to use them. It just means the experience that these people have means they're more likely to help you with your particular issue.
Definitely. And then one of the other things about the Add1Challenge is it's the perfect playground to experiment with different resources. So if there are resources that you haven't tried or methods that you haven't tried, the Add1Challenge is the perfect place to try them out and see if they work for you. And then again, as Benny said, if you ever have any questions about resources, need recommendations for what you should be doing or what you should be using, that is what I'm here for. So please send me a direct message on the Add1Challenge community site, and I will be more than happy to help. So Netizen asks, he says that he's using mostly audio resources, but he's struggling to remember much vocabulary from pure audio. So what would your recommendations be?
Yeah, I think there are different ways that people process, whether it's audible or visual information. And I know there are lots of people who actually learn, like my friend Idausa, for instance. He learns excellently on the go listening, and he doesn't necessarily need to write things down because for him, the language exists as an audible thing. For me personally, though, I would be a lot more like Netizen. I'd be saying, I heard that word, but until I write it down, and when I'm reviewing it, I need to see it written down in whether it's my app or my study notes. So you find that is essentially telling you what your learning style is. So after somebody said something, you just need to write it down, and like later on, you can add it to some form of flashcard, and maybe there's an app that you might use for that. But if you're hearing the word and then you're forgetting it very quickly, just have a little note app on your phone just to quickly write, this was the translation of this, and then later on you can structurally add it to some kind of a system. But it feels to me like you do need to write down these words. Doesn't matter if you get the spelling perfect as you're writing it down. You can look it up later to make sure you got all exactly the right accents or whatever it is. But I would recommend writing it down. That's what I do. If I'm talking and somebody says this is the translation of a word, 90% of the time I'm not going to remember it. I'm not that kind of person. I can't in the moment like take a sound and then commit it to memory. Whereas if I take my phone and write it down on whatever an Evernote or something, then later on that means I can remember it a lot easier.
All right, we'll get back to questions in just a minute, but there are a couple of nice comments in the chat. So Elizabeth says, hello, loving my Add1 journey. Thanks, Elizabeth. And the Spanish Leo says, Mini Challenge 2 has been incredibly helpful with scripting for me. You're very right about the common things that come up in every conversation. So for those of you who are new to the Add1Challenge, there are 3 different mini challenges that take place within the Add1Challenge. So each of these tackles a different skill that helps you build confidence and ability in the language to get to that 15-minute conversation. So that's what the Spanish Leo is referring to. Wilston asks, what resource should you use when you have completed the ASML series? So what would come next after a course book that is also an audio course? My recommendation would be whenever you finish a resource like that the best next resource is real people. So that would be a tutor or an exchange partner. So actually putting what you've studied in that course book to practice. I would actually say I wouldn't even wait until you're done with the resource to start doing that. But if you've already finished, real people would be a best next resource. What about you, Benny?
Yeah, I would say the same thing, because once you talk to a real person, then they will either directly help you if they're a teacher or something, or they may be able to point you in the right direction. But there is no like universal right answer that once you finish the Assamil courses, then course X is where you need to go immediately after, because we all have different learning styles. We all have different priorities and different issues we face in language learning. So when you talk with a person, you're going to see either yourself what you need to focus on next, or that person can actually help you figure that out.
All right, Elizabeth is struggling with fossilized errors. These are errors that you repeatedly make, even though you may know that it's an error that you're making. She says that she has problems in French with verb combos like je dois acheter. And she knows the rule, but her mouth still says stuff like je dois achète, and it's really frustrating. So what would your recommendation be for fossilized errors?
Yeah, that is a tricky one. I think one thing that helps with that is the consistency with which she's actually using them. So if for instance that is only coming up maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, because she might be having a conversation that frequently, then the moment of embarrassment will be there, but then it kind of loses its potency by the time the next week comes around. And I personally would have made tons of mistakes like that, and then I would make them again. So it's not like hearing them the first time and it's magically solved. But the thing is, since I hear them again the next day or maybe a few hours later, there's a certain psychological component here that forces me to stop the third time. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's Pavlovian. It's you react to this oncoming pain or something that you know is about to happen. And I kind of stop myself. I'm like, oh, hold on. I remember this. I remember pain is about to come. And it's because I didn't put an ER at the end of this. And that kind of helps you in that sense. Other than that, if it's something specific like this, you might need to do a little bit of just flashcarding and even rote to kind of say something over and over again. Je dois acheter, je dois acheter, je dois acheter. But like generally, I would actually, if possible, try to incorporate that into your studies in whatever way it would. And for me, that tends to be with flashcards. So I would have a flashcard saying, I have to buy, and then I would make sure that I see that flashcard as often as possible, or I would add in multiple variations of that. I have to fly, I have to eat. And then I would just kind of, as I turn it around, I would have to say the full version. And I keep seeing the mistake as I make it. I'll still make that mistake maybe the first 5 times, maybe the first 20 times. But eventually you will, because that's the thing, you might take 20 times, but as long as you do that intensively, you can get those 20 times out of the way in an afternoon instead of stretching them out over a month or two.
All right, Beth says that she is struggling with the motivation to stay consistent. What would your advice be in this case?
Okay, so this staying consistent, I think for me personally, whenever I have a grand plan to tackle some language challenge and then life gets in the way, I think that's always going to be an issue. But what has made the biggest difference for me has been that I have some aspect of somebody else that I have to be accountable to. So either that you within the Add1 community are saying, by next week, I'm going to do this thing, and you give it like a mini version of that, or by following our challenges that we're like directly recommending to you, or even just your teachers. And for me personally, for the longest time, just scheduling time with my teachers meant that as that was coming up, even though I was super busy and I had a lot of distractions, the fact that I had a teacher's session at 4 p.m. meant that I would consistently, at least at 3 p.m., start to do a little bit of preparation ahead of time. Whereas if I'm just deciding, I just want to improve my Spanish a little bit over the next while, then I don't have that accountability. So the consistency goes away, and all of the problems of life keeping me busy kind of just drown it out. And those problems are still there in the other situation. It just means that you have something that's kind of pushing you to be more consistent. So sometimes you might need a little bit of an outside force, because I think internally just deciding I'm going to do this every day, unless you have some kind of a consequence, and even if that's as little as feeling like you're going to let somebody down. And like for me, like years and years ago, when I started the blog, that was why I started it. I only had a few hundred readers, but I would still feel like if I don't update these guys, that I have made some kind of some kind of progress in Czech, which is the first language I was trying to learn, then I'm going to feel embarrassed, because even though it was just a few hundred people who were reading the blog, that was still a few hundred real people I didn't want to disappoint. So that's kind of where, for me, the consistency has come in. And I have definitely, since starting the blog, had periods where I have not had a lot of consistency. And to be honest, that has been the biggest difference. It's been, how accountable am I to do something on a day-to-day basis?
All right. Our next question is from Zaina. And she says that she's currently at the B1 level, but she's feeling stuck. So what can she do to push through to that B2 level?
So for me personally, the way I get to B1 level is through pure practice and speaking and making mistakes and all of that. But then I'm able to have those somewhat superficial conversations, and that's where I get stuck at the B1 level. Whereas the B2 level, you have a little bit more of eloquence to how you're speaking. You have tidied up your grammar rules and so on. And generally, whenever I get stuck anywhere on the progress of language learning, it's because what I have been doing may have worked well to get me there, but it's not working well to get me any further. So there is no language learning strategy that's going to get you from A1 to C2. But maybe what's gotten you here is great. Doesn't mean it's failed you, but you need a different strategy. For me personally, what that means is once I reach B1 and I'm able to have these basic conversations with patient speakers, the next thing I need to do is just study a grammar book. And like, this is something I never recommend people do at the start. I think it's a mistake to study grammar from the very beginning, because you don't have enough context to attach it to. You can get very intimidated very quickly. Whereas when you're at the B1 stage, you have enough experience in the language that these grammar rules start to mean something to you, and it starts to make sense because you've heard them in use so much that you connect the dots. So for me personally, I completely switch my strategy. Getting up to B1 is all speaking, conversing, and making mistakes and all of that. But getting from B1 to B2, I just go and I grab a grammar book and I do the exercises. I still have lessons with a teacher, but those lessons are very specifically tailored to solve my grammatical problems or anything else that the teacher feels is holding me back. But you have to mix things up. So in general, I would try something different, whether that's start reading more, or start watching TV shows in the language, or as I suggested, start taking grammar courses. Whatever is different, it's worth a try, because that's going to potentially kick you up a notch. But definitely don't do more of the same, if that makes sense.
All right, Wilson asks us to introduce the Add1Challenge a little bit. So there may be a few of you here who are watching who don't yet know what the Add1Challenge is. So the Add1Challenge is a community of language learners who commit to learning a language for 90 days. And all participants are aiming towards the same goal, to have a 50-minute conversation in their new language. The Add1Challenge empowers you to build a language learning routine that works for you in your everyday life. It has accountability systems, it has dream teams, and it has other elements that help you build that consistency, figure out a routine that works for you, find the resources that work for you, and help you aim towards getting to that goal. So we suggest a minimum of 2 hours of study per week. We do not teach the languages themselves, but we basically believe in the adage, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day, but if you teach a man to fish, he'll be able to eat for the rest of his life. So that's basically what we're aiming to do with the Add1Challenge, is teach you to fish. So another element of the Add1Challenge is that you have access to me. I am available to you for questions. I'm available to you to talk through methods, routines, whatever you need. And we also have regular Q&As just like this, so that we can answer your questions, so that you have access to Benny as well to ask him your questions. So you get more than one perspective, not just mine. So you get a really balanced kind of, idea ideas for learning the language, and so that would be what the Add1Challenge is. Benny, do you have anything else that you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's kind of just echoing what I said earlier. It's the community aspect, and that's something that when a lot of people learn a language and they learn it by themselves, they imagine I need exactly the right resources, or I need to change my brain in some way. But languages are this bridge between humans. It's a communication method, and that's why something like the Add1Challenge kind of it picks up on that aspect that I feel is ignored in all of the courses and things that focus on the content of the language, that sometimes you do need a little encouragement. You do need to talk to other people about the challenges you're facing. You need to see how they're progressing and how they're not progressing, and feel like you're a part of some kind of a community in that sense. And this is a big aspect of what Add1Challenge is, because of what I feel has been missing in the language learning world. And it's why we focus on this part of it instead of trying to say, here's a course, here's the words you have to learn. We focus more on what I see as the underlying issue that is not dealt with by a lot of other language learning systems. Microphone. Oh, I'm not hearing you. Is it me?
It all, and this leaves me behind in the conversation. How do I process faster and stop translating? Can you hear me, Benny?
I'm not actually hearing anything you're saying, Shannon. Are other people in the chat able to hear Shannon? I'm wondering if it's a okay, yeah, okay. I see you're typing me the question. How do I process faster and stop translating? Okay, so one way that I've stopped the translation myself has been using, instead of a dictionary, I would actually use Google Images. So if you look up on Google Images, voiture, then you'll see a thing with four wheels that you can drive, but you don't force your mind to think of the C word. That's C-A-R, in case your mind goes to not so great places. So I don't want to think of that C word. I want to think of the concept of the thing with the four wheels. So yeah, essentially that's kind of one way to help avoid translation, is to stop yourself in the tracks of that translation. And then once you're at a good enough stage, generally B1 is when I could start doing this. I would use a monolingual dictionary. So I started doing this with Spanish. It was tricky because I would look up a word I don't know yet, and it would explain it to me using other words. But the thing is, sometimes I would have a kind of an okay idea of what that word meant, but then the monolingual dictionary, which would explain it to me using other Spanish words, would get me so much closer to the concept. So I would actually understand it without necessarily having to think, oh yeah, that's reflection in Spanish. I would have the concept of what it means in my mind. So I would say a combination of the for nouns, at least, using Google Images, and then as soon as you possibly can, start using the a dictionary to avoid translation. And there are lots of other things. It's mostly a momentum thing that you want to try to, as you're constructing the words in your mind, try to think of them from the perspective of like what's the root of the word in Spanish that I'm kind of building on, because otherwise you're just taking word for word English and translating it word for word to Spanish, and that's not going to help in any form. So yeah, I can see Shannon tells me there's something wrong with my sound, so she's going to pass me on the questions as they come. Sorry about that.
So the next question is regarding the Add1Challenge, because it is a more intensive project as far as language learning goes. It might be a little bit more intense than what you're used to. So how might you deal with burnout or overwhelm? And I'm passing that on to Benny.
Okay, so how do you deal with burnout or overwhelm? Um, so if I'm working so hard in a language that I reach the stage where I kind of feel like my brain is melting out of my ears because I've been doing nothing but studying this language intensively, I think it is important to schedule in some form of pauses and breaks. So, for instance, one of my most intensive language learning projects was the time when I was learning Mandarin. And because I was like, from the moment I woke up until I went to sleep, I was studying the language or getting practice in the language. So, what I had to implement was every weekend, I would take one full day off and I would do things that were completely different. So I wouldn't have some different learning project. I might go and watch a movie in English, or I might Skype my parents for 2 hours. So sometimes scheduling in these breaks is one part of it, and that's kind of a grander scale of it. But even on the micro scale, on what you're doing on a single day, you still can think about doing this. Because one thing I found is if I try to study for 4 or 5 hours straight, the problem there is I'm gonna reach burnout and I'm just not going to be able to do it any longer. Whereas if I implement some form of the Pomodoro technique, where I'm studying for 25 intensive minutes, and then I take a 5 minute break, and I will genuinely take that break. I won't stay at my desk with my books. I'll actually stand up. I'll go to the window and I'll look at the birds tweeting. So just something completely different to get my mind off things. And I found that just by taking those 5 minute breaks, I'm able to actually have a full 5 or 6 hours of studying with just those breaks incorporated into them, which adds up to way, way more time than if I was not taking a break and forcing myself to go through all the way. So kind of you do get overwhelmed at that stage. You do need to schedule in the mini breaks, and then you need to schedule in the bigger breaks. And then finally, I would say to mix things up a bit. So if what you're learning is so like intensive for this part of the language, like the grammar or something, then you might want to switch to something else that's a little bit like not necessarily easier, but it's just a different aspect of the language that's testing you in your memory capacity instead of testing in your ability to figure out grammar, as it were. So like there are many things you can do, and you can still be improving your language skills by tackling a different aspect of the language.
All right, so to everyone in A1C38, I am looking forward to learning with you. I'll be learning German with you as a part of this challenge. And for those of you who are not enrolled in the Add1Challenge who may be watching this video, you can find more information about the Add1Challenge at add1challenge.com. And you can also sign up to get notified when the next challenge opens for enrollment. That's going to be in mid to late April. So we will be opening the next Add1Challenge then. We try to open several per year. So again, if you want more information on the Add1Challenge or to get notified when it opens for enrollment, you can go to add1challenge.com and get more information on that. And I'm going to pass it over to Benny to close out.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I really hope that anyone who's starting the Add1Challenge is going to take what we were talking about today, the community aspect of it, and don't get too overwhelmed with all of the actual resources that you're going to be using. Just make sure every day you are making progress, or what I like to call to myself, that every day I suck a little less in the language. And that's the goal of this community. Is keep in mind, we're all learning together. We're all making mistakes. Nobody is doing this perfectly, but as a community, we can all support one another. And that's what the Add1Challenge is going to be about. So I hope anyone joining us this time is going to enjoy it. And otherwise, if you're just discovering it, then check out the website and you can learn a bit more about it.
And if you have any questions that didn't get answered here, you can post them in the question channel in the community, and I will be more than happy to tackle them there. So I look forward to learning with all of you. Have a nice day.